I was soaking wet, splashing through the puddles of pouring rain on my way home from high school. And I couldn't stop smiling. "What are you smiling about?" my mom asked as I came through the door. "I was talking to Elva," I said. I walked her home from the bus stop. That's how my mom was. She always knew how I felt. There was no one else in the world that I was so close to. I grew up in a small village in the northwest corner of Bosnia, the youngest in the family, with two older sisters. Our small house was surrounded by land that we shared with neighbors, where we all had orchards and fields. When you saw a neighbor working in the field, like gathering hay that we raised for animals, you went over to help. That went without saying. Everyone did that. No one asked you to do it, you just did it, right? When war started, I was barely 20 years old. We watched on TV as the Serb forces captured city after city, coming closer to our village. Bosnia just had become independent, and there was no Bosnian army, so everyone got what they had, handguns, a few bullets. We dug trenches above the village and took turns being on duty. For every person who had a gun, there were at least two other people who didn't have anything. If one person fell, his buddy would pick up the gun and continue fighting. We were the only line of defense between our families and the attackers. On one of my breaks from guarding the village, my oldest sister and her husband came to visit, and they brought their 3-month-old baby for the first time. At the time, my younger sister and my father were inside the house admiring the baby, and my oldest sister and my mother were standing outside talking. My brother-in-law and I went to the orchard to pick some pears. Shelling started, and even though we were used to it, we realized this one was very close, and we made the decision to go inside the house where we would be safer. Just as we were coming around the corner of the house, a shell landed very close to us. I found myself laying on the ground with a mouthful of dirt and gunpowder. I looked over to my left side and realized that my left arm was almost completely detached. I was in shock, and I actually didn't even realize how bad the injuries were. I was calling for help, and no one was coming. Eventually, I put my head down and said to myself, I'm not going to fight it anymore. I said my prayers, and I was at peace with dying. What happened was, as the neighbors approached the house to help, they ended up helping other family members and didn't even realize that I was laying on the side of the house. Sometime later, my best friend found me, and he did his best to stop the bleeding and to treat my other injuries. And looking back, now I realize he actually saved my life. Then came a haze of ambulance trips and surgeries. My injuries were so severe that in order for me to get treatment that I needed, I had to leave Bosnia. But how? We were completely surrounded. See, in war, everything can become a bargaining chip, including hospital patients. About 2 weeks later, I ended up being part of one of those deals where the enemy forces agreed to allow 2 Bosnian patients to leave the area at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I was one of those 2. I ended up in a hospital in Slovenia where I spent the next 9 months. I spoke Bosnian, they spoke Slovenian, but we managed. The rest of my family was back in Bosnia, far away. Our conversations with my younger sister and my dad were always short because they were expensive. But every time I would ask about my mother and sister, they would always say, "Oh, they're not here right now." I did have a cousin who was living nearby and who came to visit me on a regular basis. And he always tried to stay positive. But I knew if my mother and sister were never coming to the phone and no one was talking about them, I knew they were gone. Several months had passed, and I knew that I had to confront the situation. I decided to make it easier on both of us and not ask my cousin what happened. I just couldn't ask if they're dead. Just couldn't say those words. So on his next visit, I said to my cousin, "I think I know what's going on with my mother and sister. Can you just tell me if it's one or both of them?" He hung his head and said very softly, "Both." He left, and I was awake all night, just imagining how I'm never going to see them again. And I was so close to both of them. My mother really was something special. I can never explain how important she was in my life. Those were the worst 10 days of my life. I had to learn to live without them. It was a long night. That particular night specifically was difficult. It was a very long night. And wherever my mind wandered, it all looked terrible. Pain had become my constant companion, something always on the edge of my consciousness. At last, I decided that those are things beyond my control. war, even my family dying. It didn't mean that the pain was gone. It didn't mean that I quit thinking about them or praying for them. I was in the parallel process of grieving and looking at my own reality. Somehow I came to understand that I had to move on and make the best of it. It was probably partly positivity that my parents instilled in me, and partly the strong faith that I was brought up in. The doctors there in Slovenia decided not to do reconstructive surgery on my left arm. The risks were simply too great, and the chance of any success was way too small. And I was really disappointed. All that time, I kept thinking and expecting them to do the surgery no matter the outcome. But it wasn't going to happen. If someone would come to visit at that time, my life at that time was really just getting to the end of the day. If someone would come to visit, they might take me outside in a wheelchair for half an hour, and that was the biggest event of the day. But then things started happening. One day a man came in, we talked, he took a lot of pictures, and then he left. He told me he was Bosnian, and his hometown was actually only 20 miles from my home. But now he lives in the United States. Of course, secretly, I was hoping he would do something for me. But why would he, after all? I had no reason to believe that he would or could do something for me. Next thing I know, I had a tourist visa, the quickest kind to get, and I was on my way to Roseburg, Oregon. I felt immediately at home when I came to Roseburg, partly because it reminded me so much of my village. What had happened, the wife of the gentleman who visited me was attending a fundraising event for Bosnian refugees in Portland, Oregon. There she was chatting with a doctor from Roseburg and told him about her husband's visiting me. Later on, that doctor went back to Roseburg and talked to one of his colleagues, a plastic surgeon. And right then and there, the two doctors decided that they're going to try to help me. They persuaded a hospital in Roseburg to take my case at no charge. So that's the background of the story. As soon as he saw my situation, the plastic surgeon in Roseburg realized that he was going to need some help. So he contacted another friend of his in Springfield, Illinois, another plastic surgeon, who agreed to fly out to Oregon to help with the surgery. The two doctors did the surgery pro bono. It was expected to last 12 hours and ended up being 18 hours. When I was done with that, I needed years of therapy. And so a family in Roseburg took me in. A Baptist church organized an event to raise money for me. A Jewish woman, a lawyer, helped me get political asylum. An ESL teacher came to the hospital to teach me the basics of conversation. See, I spoke no English when I came here. One day when I was having therapy, physical therapy, a guy in a wheelchair came in. He said he heard about me on TV, and he had brought me a car. It was one he adapted to use hand controls, and now he was getting something else. It was just what I needed. He gave me the keys and the title, and he said, the car will need a little bit of work. My physical therapist was standing there, and he said, oh, I like to work on cars. Let me take a look. You know what happens next, right? He fixed it. What are the chances of all of those things happening? All of those people coming at the right time and place? The truth is, so many people stepped up to help me along the way, and each gift they gave, whether large or small, was equally important. And each reveals the beauty of human nature. A few years later, when I was able to return to Bosnia, there was that girl from the bus stop. Still with a sparkle in her eyes. We got married, and now we live in the United States. And we take our kids back to the village every year. Of all of my miracles, that is the greatest one, that we found each other again. Thank you.